Okay, we're live. This is a rogue edition of Deeper Than Dogma. We're going to discuss presuppositionalism. I'm going to give a presentation, and this is a continuing presentation that I had back in December, and you can find that presentation on Xbox's channel, as well as it's mirrored on my channel as well. It's called Floyd's Take on the Precept Argument, First Look. So that was the first video. It was just recently posted, although I had this back in December, and this is a continuation of that presentation. And who knows? There'll probably be more. I guess we'll keep on having them until presuppositionalism is finally dead. But I'll start my presentation now, and we'll get started. All right, so can you guys see that?
Yeah, yes we can.
All right, so a lot of discussions about presuppositionalism is basically how do you know things, a knowledge talk, knowledge claims, how do you justify them? So I'm going to start with a little review from my last presentation. When we talk about knowledge, often we hear the term epistemology. What epistemology is it's a theory of knowledge. It attempts to answer the questions like, what is knowledge, and how can we know things, and how can we obtain knowledge, and so forth. Another term that I'll be using is what's called ontology. There's different meanings of it. In philosophy, the term can mean the branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being, of the nature of the identity, the nature of something. And also, the way I'll be using it is, in logic, it's a set of entities presupposed by a theory. So what that means is, it's basically the set of entities that exists within your worldview. So, for example, within my worldview, cars exist, and horses exist, and the earth exists, and mind-independent reality exists. For Christians, those things could exist as well, but in their worldview, demons can also exist, and angels can exist, and so forth, things like that. So ontology is basically the set of entities that exist within your worldview. What a presupposition will do when talking about epistemology is they'll often offer an account of their epistemology by appealing to their ontology, while they demand others to justify their epistemology with their epistemology. So what I mean by that is, when they say, well, how can you know things? They'll say, oh, well, my God created us in his own image, and he gave us senses and a mind, so we can know things. So so the things that exist in my worldview, to be more specific here, my God created us so we can know things. But they'll ask you, well, how do you know your epistemology is correct? When you ask how do you know something, you appeal to your epistemology. So if you try to justify your epistemology with your epistemology, that's a logically circular argument, and that's what they'll usually call you on. So again, they'll appeal to just their metaphysical backstory of what exists in their worldview to account for, not justify, but account for how they can know things. Well, I'll get a little bit more deeper into that a little later. A big issue with knowing things for a lot of the cyclone presuppositionalists is the idea of certainty. Unless you're certain about something, you really can't know it. It comes down to two different philosophies here. One's fallibilism. And fallibilism is the view that we could be wrong about our beliefs, but still be justified in holding incorrect beliefs. The cyclone presuppositionists will say, no, you need to have infallibility. And that means a term to mean that knowledge requires certainty. So you need to be absolutely certain for it to be considered knowledge. But the question is, well, what do we exactly mean by certain, and how does that apply to justification? A lot of people are fallibilists, and I kind of see myself as a fallibilist. You could be wrong, but if your presuppositions are correct, you are able to know things. But it's a very hard concept to kind of understand. I don't know, Ozzy, could you shed any light on the difference between fallibilism and infallibility?
I don't know that there's much to say on it there. I mean, fallibilism is, as you wrote there, the view that we could be wrong about our beliefs, and what that means is that, in principle, any particular belief that you have is subject to revision, rejection, or some other kind of change. Um, uh, and that doesn't mean that everything in your belief, you think that everything in your belief set is wrong all at once, but that any particular thing in your belief set could be mistaken. Not that the entirety of your belief set is mistaken. So when a person admits to fallibilism, he or she is conceding that any particular fact in their belief set could be mistaken. But they are not conceding that the entirety of their belief set is mistaken. And that's actually kind of important when talking with a cyclone presuppositionalist, because they will sometimes have a tendency to suggest that if you concede that any particular thing in your belief set is mistaken, that you are evacuating the all claims to know anything from your belief set. And that doesn't follow. That's a complete non sequitur when they try to pull that move. And what was the other term that you wanted to me to elaborate on?
Well, the idea that we must have certainty to have knowledge.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that is really sort of an odd thing. I mean, there are some philosophers who will insist that in order to know something, you would have to be certain. That in order to know something, you would not just have to know that thing, but you'd have to be justified, and it wouldn't be sufficient to have a justification. It wouldn't be sufficient that there be a justification. You'd have to know the justification. Not only would you have to be aware of that justification, but you would have to know that the justification is itself true. You'd have to know that you know. In order to know a proposition, you'd have to know that you know it. That's called the KK principle, the know that you know principle. And that is a principle that is not very well subscribed by epistemologists, because if it's true that in order to know a proposition, you have to know that you know, it immediately sets you onto a path for an infinite regress, and there's no way out of that regress, because any reason or any claim that you made that you think would putatively get you out of the regress is itself a claim that you would have to know that you know, and you'll be back in the regress. So the KK principle is generally rejected, and so most philosophers don't think that certainty is any part of the definition of knowledge. The definition of empirical knowledge, for instance, might be something like justified true belief or reliably produced true belief. There's all kinds of definitions of knowledge out there, but certainty is usually not included among them, because as soon as you include certainty among them, you're effectively saying knowledge is a concept that has no application. There are no instances of knowledge. It would never be the case that anyone could know anything, ever. I mean, even a god couldn't know it. Couldn't know anything if that were true, because even a god would end up in an infinite justificatory regress, out of which even a god would not be able to escape. So unless you just posit that the god does know everything, but then that's an argument by stipulation. So certainty is not normally understood to be a part of the definition of knowledge. It's not to be identified with truth. It's not to be identified with justification. It's certainly not equivalent to knowledge. And anyone who tries to suggest that knowledge implies certainty has sort of a tough row to hoe. It's actually a difficult argument to make. And in any case, certainty is a word which is not categorical. People will often say that if you're certain about something, you're either certain or you're not. It's categorical. It's all or none. But if you in fact attend to how people use the word certainty, you'll discover something rather obvious that people have a tendency to overlook, and that is that certainty is something that admits of degrees. It makes perfect sense to say, how certain are you of that? Right? Just how certain are you of that? Right? We ask that all the time. Certainty admits of degrees. You can be more or less certain, and that's because certainty, when you ask the question, are you certain of that, what you're asking is for the person's degree of confidence. You want to know just how confident they are. And certainty is a word that we sometimes use to reserve for a sense of maximal confidence in a proposition. but we also use it in a looser sense. And when you're using it in a sense of maximal confidence, it still refers to confidence. It's still a qualifier that means I am as confident as I can be. But that doesn't imply that you couldn't be wrong. Certainty means, well, if you're certain of something, it means that you can't muster doubt. It means indubitability. But the fact that you can't muster a doubt about something doesn't imply that you couldn't be wrong about it. Indubitability isn't inerrancy, and it isn't irrevisability, and it isn't incorrigibility. These are all terms that mean different things. So you can be certain about something, that is, feel certain, be absolutely confident of something, and be mistaken. And you can be absolutely right about something and have doubts about it. So certainty is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowledge. And anybody who tries to sort of define knowledge as justified true belief and then tries to insist on certainty is now smuggling in another condition into their definition of knowledge. Now what they're actually saying is knowledge is justified, true, certain belief. But what does confidence have to do with anything there? Absolutely, it's not a term that co-varies with veracity. Certainty is not a guarantee of veracity. And so that's why philosophers generally think that certainty plays no part in a proper definition of the concept of knowledge.
Yeah, I heard some people claim, well, certainty means that there's no possible way that it can be wrong. Well, if a proposition is true, there is no possible way for it to be false, because why? Because it's true.
Right, it's definitional.
So whether it's true or not is regardless of whether you're justified for it. It could be true, it could be false. You could have a justification for it or not have a justification for it. But just saying there's no possible way you can be wrong, it can be wrong. Well, that's just another saying it's true. And you can say, well, there's no possible way I could be wrong. Well, that's just saying that you have a proposition that happens to be true. So, within that, definition of justified true belief, it still doesn't quite fit. It just means true. So the fact that you're just saying knowledge is a true belief more than anything.
Yeah, actually, that's an important point. I actually have a short video on this called Bible Thumping Wingnut Asks Me About Certainty, where I talk about this. And there's an equivocation that happens when people say, no, certainty implies truth. And the reason they think that is because there's another word that we use all the time, and that word is certitude. Like if I say such and such is a certitude, that this is a glass of beer is a certitude. I'm using the word certitude there as a cognate for truth. It means truth. To say that something is a certitude is to say that it's a truth, right? And we sometimes use the word certainty. Certainty is a homonym. It has multiple different usages. One of the usages of certainty is as a cognate for truth. I can say such and such is a certainty. It's just like saying such and such is a certitude. I'm just saying that that's a truth. But when I ask you, how certain are you of that? You'll notice that I can't substitute in how certainty are you of that, or how certitude are you of that. You can't. You can't substitute these terms. They're not co-referential terms. Certainty refers, when you ask it as a question that way, you're asking for a person's degree of confidence, the degree of conviction with which they hold a proposition. When we use certainty as a cognate for truth, just like we use the word certitude as a cognate for truth, you can't ask a person, are you certainty of that? It just doesn't work. And if it is a cognate for truth, then all you're saying when you say that knowledge implies certainty is you're saying that knowledge implies truth. Yes, we know that. Truth is part of the definition of knowledge. Virtually every definition of knowledge, not all of them, but virtually every definition of knowledge on offer includes truth in the concept. So packing in the word certainty contributes nothing there. So if you're using certainty to mean truth as equivalent for truth, you don't need it. It's redundant. You've already got truth in your definition. And if you mean certainty in the relevant sense when you ask the question, how certain are you of that, or are you certain of that, you're talking about confidence. That is a biographical fact about a person's degree of conviction. It has nothing to do with truth.
Okay. All right. So one thing that comes up is having an account. The presuppositions will say, how do you account for X? How do you account for logic? How do you account for morality? How do you account for your reasoning? And often it's conflated with justification for. So the idea of account for versus justification for. The presuppositionists will ask you for a rational justification for our presuppositions, for example. They'll ask you if you use your reason to determine if you're reasoning properly. So they're asking for a rational justification to determine whether you're reasoning correctly. And of course, you're going to use your reason. So they're asking for a logical justification. Well, obviously, that's circular. And that's what they'll say if you try to justify your reasoning using your reasoning. Well, how do they get out of this pickle? They offer an account. They will then give an account for the use of reason, memory, and senses. In other words, they will offer their story for where these things come from or what caused them. So again, they're appealing to their ontology. They'll say, oh, well, my God created us in his own image. He gave us reason, memory, senses, so we can know things. So therefore, there is my account for, or my justification for, why we can reason and so forth. So again, this is just an account. This is a story. Well, we can do the same thing. We can say, oh, well, our reasoning, our memory, our senses came about through a natural selection, where the natural environment and so forth conditioned us to be able to reason and have good senses and memory. So we can give our story as well. But the question comes down to, do we actually need an account? Do we need to actually explain where these things come from? That would certainly be nice to know, but regardless of what account, what story you have, those things still have to be valid. So no matter what story you come up with, it really doesn't matter if those things aren't working properly to begin with. Honestly, do you think, as an atheist or as any person, you actually need to have an account for everything?
Well, a couple of things to say about an account. To give an account of something is usually to give an explanation, but we also use it to mean to give a justification. Now, to give an explanation is to explain why something is the way it is, normally, like a causal explanation. To give a justification is not to just explain why something is the way it is, but it's to give a reason why one should think something is true. It's to supply a reason that is persuasive, that should for a rational person, demand their assent, that they would affirm the proposition is true. That's what a justification is, as opposed to just a causal account or an explanatory story. Now, sometimes giving an explanatory story will suffice as a justification, because really what it would take for you to believe something is to understand what caused what, right? But we have to make sure that we don't equivocate between a causal explanation or a causal story, which, if true, would justify, and something that actually is a justification. So anybody can come up with some metaphysical picture of reality such that if that metaphysical picture of reality is true, then that would justify believing such and such. But you can always ask, yes, but is there a reason to think that that metaphysical story is true? What's missing there is that it's actually not a justification. So having an account of something, I mean, I can account for why this beer tastes good because there are magical beer pixies that move around in there, and they, squirt out flavor into the beer, or they squirt out some kind of substance which, when it sits on my tongue, makes me approve of the taste. If that story is true, that would explain why the beer tastes good. If that story is true. But if that story is not true, then it wouldn't be the right explanation. And if it's not the right explanation, then it couldn't serve as a justification. So merely having a story is not a justification. It's only a justification if the story is true and if you have a reason to think that it's true. And so that's the problem with an account. Now, with respect to whether or not we need an account, it depends. What do you need an account for? My dog knows if there's food in his dog dish. He knows if there's water in his dog bowl. Okay? He doesn't have an account. He doesn't have a theory of mind. He doesn't have an epistemological theory, not even of the crudest sort. Right? He just looks in the bowl, and he has a visual experience of food in his bowl, and And that's sufficient for my dog to know that there's food in his bowl. Okay? Of course, he could be mistaken, but under the right conditions, under those right causal circumstances, when my dog is looking into his dog dish and sees dog food or water, my dog's belief that there's dog food and water in his serving bowls uh, uh, fully justifies his belief. But my dog doesn't need a justification, and my dog doesn't even need an account because it doesn't need a justification. Who needs an account? Well, an epistemologist needs an account, right? So if you're a philosopher, you need an account. If you're doing sort of philosophy of knowledge, then you need an account. But you don't need an account to know things. You need an account to understand what constitutes knowledge, whether something is knowledge, and whether under the present circumstances you in fact know what you think that you know. That's when you need an account. But you don't need an account to know anything. And if a person wants to insist on that, that needs an argument.
Yeah, it's like saying, for me to be able to drive my car to work, I need to know how the car engine works.
That's interesting. Sai actually used that example on me about, well, you can say you can drive, but if you don't know how it works, then. But the last couple of things you guys just said, I think, really cuts to the heart of it, because that is actually the claim you hear from the cyclone tier, you know, they call them the sub-Bonson presuppositionalists, is to say if you don't have an account, then you really can't know anything. That's expressly how they put it, including, like I say, in a chat I had with Saito and Brutenkate, specifically using the example of the driving a car, not really knowing how it works.
There's an interesting parallel here, because you'll often hear these same presuppositionalists say that you need an account of morality. If you can't account for morality, then you've got a problem with your worldview. And of course, if you don't have an account of morality, if you don't have an account of knowledge, if you don't have an account of beauty, if you don't have an account of knowledge, then of course there is something missing from your picture of reality, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things missing from my picture of reality. You know, I don't know how a twin cam engine works. You know, I don't know what a twin cam engine is. It's missing from my picture of reality. Do I need to know that? Well, not to drive a car with a twin cam engine, I don't. But what's interesting is that these same people will tell you, oh yes, of course, an atheist or non-believer can be moral, but he or she lacks an account of morality. Well, wait a minute. If I can be moral without an account of morality, why can't I have knowledge if I don't have an account of knowledge, right? They seem to be playing by two sets of rules. When it comes to morality, they're often in the habit of saying, oh yes, of course, atheists can be moral. They can do the right thing. They can do the wrong thing. They're still moral agents, which is why God can judge them and condemn them. But what they're missing is an account. Well, that means then is that an account is not necessary for being moral. Well, why, when it comes to knowledge, is an account necessary to have knowledge? Why is an account of knowledge necessary to have knowledge? That's kind of odd. Why this discontinuity? And that's never explained. And I think it's because this particular form of presuppositionalism, this epistemic cyclone version of presuppositionalism, was not developed by a philosopher.
Yeah, and often you'll hear from creationists, like, science cannot account for abiogenesis, or science can't explain how the Big Bang actually started and so forth, and they'll say, oh well, we can explain it, our God did it. And so, well, how did God create the first life? Oh well, we don't need to know exactly how, we just know he did do it. So it's kind of a double standard where they're asking us, well, science has to explain everything about how things were done, but we don't. We just says, okay, we know where it came from, but we don't need to know exactly how it was done. Well, we could say the same thing. Oh, well, natural forces created it. It came from natural forces, but we don't know how exactly it came about. We just know natural forces did it. So, it just seems like a wash. When asked whether we need to count, philosopher Gene Whitmer, he's a philosopher, I believe, University of Florida. I'm not exactly sure. He wrote, indeed, you can always say that it's part of your view that no account or basis is needed. If they say that this is not fair, that of course you have to have an account. You can then say that this is an external criticism, not an internal one, and they're begging the question. They're relying on their presuppositions about what is needed. If they can demand that you give an account or basis or whatnot, then you can demand that they meet some demand of yours. Say a demand that their claims about God be testable by empirical investigation. They won't like that. And if anyone's interested in the paper where that comes from, I give the title there. I'm not sure if it's available on the internet. If someone's interested with it, they can just contact me. I believe it was available on the internet at one point. I'm not sure if it is now. But this is a paper about presuppositionalism. Based on my worldview. So a lot of times when presuppositionists will ask questions, where things come from, how do you account for things, they'll answer based on their worldview. Again, they're appealing to the ontology. So in accounting for logic, morality, reason, senses, they base it on the presupposition, and that is different from justifying them logically or admitting that you are fallible. So there's a difference between justifying our beliefs based on your fallible nature and justifying your beliefs based on the presuppositions of your worldview. So when asked these things, they'll just stick with their worldview and say, oh, well, within my worldview, God did it, or it's part of God's nature, or some sort of variety of that, or it reflects the mind of God in terms of like logic and so forth. So that's something to keep in mind when they answer these questions. They always do it based on my worldview. So when they ask you the question, how do you know there's a mind-independent reality? Refute solipsism. Well, you can appeal to your worldview. Well, in my worldview, a mind-independent reality exists. So I'll get into a little bit more detail about that a little later. Presuppositionists, they also preach the myth of neutrality. They claim that there is no neutral ground. For example, Dr. Greg Bahnsen, he was a leading presuppositionalist. He was a student of Cornelius Van Til, and he was a major figure in promoting presuppositionalism. He wrote that there is no neutral territory between the covenant keepers and the covenant breakers. The antithesis of principle is equally real and equally basic to every point of contact between them. The fate of the empire is always involved. Boy, fate of the empire kind of sounds like a Sith. The analogy they give is that each of us are in our own ivory tower. So the Calvinist presuppositionist is in his ivory tower, in his worldview, holding on to his presuppositions, and we're in our own ivory tower with our presuppositions, and we're basically just yelling at each other. Since we come from basically different starting points, there is no neutral ground, and that's how they see it. They see worldviews as hermetically sealed bubbles in which you can only really critique them from within, and it creates a very us versus them attitude. It says, they're not us. And the example I gave, they're covenant keepers and we're the covenant breakers. Cornelius Van Til states that the antithesis is between those whom the final center of reference in knowledge lies in man, and those whom the final center of reference for knowledge lies in God, as this God speaks in Scripture. So again, they separate people getting their knowledge from God, basically them, to everyone else who gets their knowledge from our fallible human nature. But that's a very external critique. They're basically saying, oh, well, we get our knowledge from God, and everyone else gets their knowledge from man. I'm sure a Muslim or a Jewish person or a person of another faith would think otherwise. But they're actually projecting their worldview onto other people, claiming that, well, we're from God and everyone else is from man. Again, Greg Bahnsen states, as such, presuppositions have the greatest authority in one's thinking, being treated as one's least negotiable beliefs and being granted the highest immunity to revision.
Could I say something about worldviews and the idea of neutrality.
Sure.
First, just a word about worldview, because it's a word that gets bandied about an awful lot, and a lot of people are sort of tired of it because they keep hearing it in the same kind of tedious context. But I mean, the word worldview, I don't think is an ugly word that we should shy away from. I mean, a worldview is just the totality of your belief set. It's your picture of reality. It's your map of reality. It's your outlook on the world, and it includes not just your explicit conscious beliefs that you have deliberated over and arrived at quite consciously, but all of your implicit beliefs, your tacit opinions, for instance. It includes your values, and of course it includes your beliefs, explicit and implicit, about how you ought to arrive at your beliefs. Now, what that means is that if you are trying to evaluate one person's belief set or their picture of reality against another's or your own, how are you to do this fairly? I mean, supposing I want to understand another person's worldview, but part of understanding their worldview is part of understanding their epistemology, their theory of knowledge, and how one arrives at knowledge, and how one should revise one's beliefs, and what are the rational principles according to their worldview. Well, if I'm going to evaluate their worldview, presumably I'm going to use my own sense of rationality, right? And this presents a problem, because if a worldview includes your sense of rationality and your sense, your epistemology, the principle, the standards by which you evaluate theories and propositions, then you're going to have a problem when you try to evaluate another person's worldview. You're presumably going to use your own epistemological principles, or you're going to use theirs. If you use your own, you are analyzing their worldview from your worldview. You are analyzing theirs from the outside. That would be an external analysis. And if you were to criticize it, that would be an external critique of their worldview. If you adopt theirs, you have to bracket your own worldview, suspend it temporarily for the sake of argument. You don't have to actually stop believing it. You just bracket it for the purposes of argument, and then you operate within the scope of their worldview, within the scope of their beliefs, their belief set, and then you evaluate their worldview and try to find consistencies and inconsistencies and inadequacies in their worldview using the contents of their belief set. So I think that, strictly speaking, it's correct to say that worldviews are incommensurable. You can't reduce one to the other typically, and there is no neutral standpoint, because whatever standpoint you're going to evaluate a person's worldview from, you're going to be evaluating it using certain standards, using certain criteria. You're going to be operating within some kind of worldview when you do it. So there is no neutral perspective from which to evaluate something as fundamental as a value system, an epistemology, a metaphysic, an ontology, an axiology, all of that stuff, a moral system. So I think that the presuppositionalists are right here. I mean, this isn't an insight that they developed, but I mean, they're right to harp on this. But I don't think it's right to imagine that once you have a worldview, you're locked into it, and that you can't revise your belief set, and that you either have to hold to it or abandon it wholesale and then jump into another one. That's not true. People revise their beliefs within the scope of their own belief set. They can revise their beliefs. They can even revise their own epistemological standards. It's just not true that belief sets or worldviews are these hermetically sealed bubbles, and that there's no way to revise and even drastically transform your belief set without completely abandoning it and adopting another one. That's not true. That's simply a mistake. It's false to fact. I mean, you only have to look at people who have slowly evolved from one belief to another and contrast that with people who have, in fact, drastically abandoned one set of beliefs for another entire belief set.
Yeah, and I asked the question, do we have anything in common? Can we have anything in common with the Christian or with anyone with a different worldview? You know, can we appeal to our humanity, for example? Can we appeal to our common nature, our common needs and goals and so forth? I wonder if that could be a common ground in which we can work together. But I guess it's up to the individual whether they want to go there or not. But you know, it almost seems like they're saying, oh well, we're all different aliens coming from different planets. I mean, are we that different? I don't know. I kind of think we all kind of start with our consciousness and we work out from there, and we're all fellow human beings. But are we really that different where we don't have anything in common at all? I don't know. It seems like they're making an effort to shut the doors. I know Saka, and I think Xbox was there as well. We had a conversation with presuppositionalists a month or so ago, and we talked about the analogy of two ivory towers. And the way he described it was that in his view, there's only one ivory tower, his worldview. And so, because his worldview is the only one that can actually create the ivory, basically his God. So Saka, I thought you made a good analogy that it's like there's only one ivory tower with no windows to peer out at all.
And that's what he was unwilling to. He was unwilling to bracket his, like you were saying a minute ago. He was unwilling to bracket his and look at others for the sake of argument, because he said if he were to do that, that would automatically mean his was false, and his can't be false. So he was unwilling to bracket that.
Right. Yeah. To step outside of his worldview would be it's the idea that doubting is the sin. That you can't doubt your worldview at all. That you have to have the only tower, and you can encourage them. You can be like, listen, just come over here for a second, step out, take a look at mine, tell me what you think, and they're like, no, it doesn't exist, and that's what you have to deal with.
There's a hugely important. Oh, sorry, Hogtie, you were about to say something? Okay. There's a hugely important point that needs to be made when one of these cyclones says, "No, I refuse to operate within the scope of your assumptions, because doing so would be a betrayal of my beliefs. It would be turning my back on God." I mean, I've heard Seitan Bruggencate himself make the same kind of objection. There's a real problem with that, and that is that the way they're supposed to proceed is through internal critique. The presuppositionalist believes that worldviews are these logically separate, incommensurable worldviews from which there's no neutral ground. And the way that they're supposed to proceed to establish that your worldview as a non-believer or a believer in another faith is inadequate is by operating within the scope of your assumptions and showing that within the scope of your assumptions, your worldview is either inconsistent or inadequate in some respect to account for this, that, and the other thing. The only way you can effectuate an internal critique is to operate within the scope of the other person's worldview, within the scope of their beliefs and assumptions and presuppositions. That's what an internal critique means. And so when they say, "I will not abandon my presuppositions," but then they're going to do an internal critique of yours, they don't know what they're talking about. Just flat out contradiction. They don't understand what an internal critique is. They don't understand that that is how presuppositionalism, properly understood, tries to establish the falsity of another worldview. Not because it contradicts Christians' presuppositions, but that without Christian presuppositions, on the assumptions of the non-Christians' views, there is an inadequacy or an inconsistency here that is so damning that the worldview is incoherent or just not feasible. That's how it's supposed to be. The only way that a presuppositionalist can effectuate an internal critique is by bracketing his or her own worldviews and presuppositions for the sake of argument, to adopt the other person's presuppositions for the sake of argument in order to evaluate the worldview from within that worldview, not from within their own worldview. And I think that a lot of these cyclones are just too philosophically unsophisticated to understand what presuppositionalism, properly construed, actually demands of them. They're really trying to have it both ways. And it just doesn't make sense. It's complete nonsense. When they do that, they are effectuating an external critique. But when they're effectuating an external critique and saying the problem with your worldview is that it violates my Christian presuppositions, all they're saying is the problem with your worldview is that it's not my worldview.
I disagree with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. It's very persuasive.
That shines a light on something that absolutely puzzled me about what some of them are doing. Like sometimes you'll make a point, so well, imagine this, or suppose that there's a God that has these attributes instead of the God you're talking about, and they're just like, well, I can't do that because that goes against my worldview. So, well, that's not the point. We were talking about a hypothetical here. They do. I mean, when they do the so-called internal critique on our worldview, are they not stepping out of their worldview? Are they not, donning our shoes, as it were? See, I strongly suspect that a lot of times that these answers that come off these index cards that they all get with their Seitan Brugengate DVD box set, a lot of times these are like get out of jail free cards. You ask a question that's a little bit tricky, then they'll say, oh, well, I'm not going to discuss this with someone who can't justify their reason, or they just have these things so I don't have to answer the question. I'd always got the vibe when they say, well, if I were to play your hypothetical, that would be me denying God. That just, well, no, you were free to do it a moment ago, but I get the impression they kind of play that now and again as just a way of dodging the topic.
They turn it around too, is if you bracket yours and take an internal critique of theirs, well, then you had to give up your atheism to defeat my argument.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so what they'll do is they'll invite you to do an internal critique in their worldview. For example, they'll say, oh, well, if my God exists and we're made in his image and he gave us a brain and a mind and valid senses, can't we know things? Well, yeah, if all those things are true, yes, you can know things. But then they'll perform an external critique on your worldview. They'll make you justify, well, how do you know your presuppositions are true? That's an external critique, so it's a double standard, where they're inviting you to do an internal critique on their worldview, but then doing an external critique on your worldview. So it's a double standard, and that's something you need to be aware of. I offered this slide in my last presentation. It's a good time to repeat it again, the difference between an internal critique and an external critique. An internal critique assumes the truth of the worldview in order to examine that would be what would be the case if it were true. It's a type of reductio ad absurdum to show that given the premises, the conclusion leads to a contradiction, and it stays within the bounds of the belief set. So assuming that the presuppositions and the beliefs within that belief set are true, where does that actually lead you? Where an external critique, it doesn't accept the presuppositions of the other's worldview. It doesn't assume the truth of them, but rather it questions those very beliefs themselves. So we'll hear this over and over again. How do you justify that there's a mind-independent reality? How do you justify your reasoning? How do you justify your senses and so forth? So it goes beyond the bounds of the belief set. So that's something to be aware of. The difference between an internal critique or an external critique. Let's go to specific examples now. A common topic that comes up is solipsism. Solipsism is the view that there is no mind-independent reality, that everything is just an experience within your mind. There's different kinds of solipsism. There's, I guess, metaphysical or ontological solipsism that says that in actuality there is only your mind. And then there's an epistemic solipsism that says the only thing that you can actually know is within your mind. If there is an external reality, you really can't know that it is. The presupper will challenge you to refute solipsism based on what? Based on your fallible nature. They're saying, you as a fallible human being, how do you know that there's a mind-independent reality? How do you know that you're not a brain of that? How do you know that a demon, you're not under a demon spell, and everything that you experience is just an illusion? How can you know that? How do they respond? Well, they refute it based on the presuppositions of the worldview. They said, oh, well, in my worldview, there's a God, and this God created the external physical world in which we live in. Therefore, if my worldview is correct, then solipsism is false. You can actually reduce that down, saying, well, if I'm right, then I'm right. So again, they're using their ontology as a solution for their epistemology. They're saying, well, if my worldview is correct, then solipsism is false. Well, guess what? We can do the same thing. In my worldview, there's a physical universe. There's a mind-independent reality. So if my worldview is correct, solipsism is false. So again, we're just offering an account against solipsism. If our worldviews are true, then solipsism is false. But of course, can you convince a solipsist of that if they don't share your presuppositions?
Yeah, and as you said, that argument is merely saying if my worldview is true, then solipsism is false. Is merely saying if solipsism is false, then solipsism can't be true. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's axiomatic. Yes. If it turns out that solipsism is false, then it's not true. Wow. Wow. That's some argument.
We're breaking ground with this now.
Yeah. All right. Next example. Okay, here's the famous Psi 10 Bruggencate question. Could you be wrong about everything you claim to know? Well, when you hear that, again, go back to my original slide. Based on what? Based on one's fallibility or based on the presuppositions of my worldview? How do they answer that? They answer it based on the presuppositions of the worldview. If my God exists and we're created in His image and He gave us our cognitive abilities and senses and so forth, then we can know things. Voila, problem solved. If I think what happens with atheists and so forth is we try to be intellectually honest and say, well, gee, I'm a fallible human being. I could be wrong about things. Gee, could I be wrong about everything? Well, perhaps. I guess you could make claims like, oh well, I'm certain that I can know that I don't know everything. I'm not omniscient, or I know that I'm not your God. You can play little tricks like that. I think Ozzy, didn't you say you could say, well, for us to understand your question, we had to know the semantics of the question that the cyclone asked us.
Yeah, actually, the presuppositionalist Bible thumping wingnut over a year ago made a video asking all atheists if they could answer that question, and he asked specifically to hear from some people. He named me specifically, so I made a very short video about 6 minutes long called Bible thumping wingnut asked me about certainty, in which I answered that question. He wasn't satisfied with the question. He thought I was sort of doing an end run around it. So in the video description box, I wrote a lengthy response. If anyone's interested, they can go look at it there. I wrote a sort of multi-paragraph response, but the answer to the question would depend entirely on what you mean by everything you know. I mean, just how far would you extend the scope of that everything? For instance, what about my lexical beliefs? Those would be my beliefs about the words that I'm using right now, that you're hearing right now. Could I be wrong even about those? Well, if I were, I couldn't even understand the question. So to answer the question, could I be wrong about everything I think I know? Even to understand the question, one has to assume that one knows the meanings of the words one's hearing and speaking, right? So doubt, the ability to doubt something, comes after a feeling of certainty, a feeling of conviction, and the assumption that one knows a lot of things. We presuppose a whole lot, before we can ever muster a doubt about anything. So the very question, could you be wrong about everything you think you know, presupposes that I have lexical knowledge and that I understand the words coming out of your mouth when you ask me that question. Your question, when you ask that question, is granting me knowledge, assumes that I do have knowledge. So what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to say, okay, I'll have to assume that I don't understand the words coming out of your mouth? Well, then how could I answer that question? I can only answer that question on the assumption that I do have some knowledge, lexical knowledge. You can't ask that question without crediting and granting the other person some knowledge that you also think you have. So the question is kind of a fatuous question.
Well, and what does it mean to ask someone what they think they know?
Well, everything that you think you know. I mean, I would say I know that this is a glass of beer, and you'd say, really? Yeah. Well, that's what I think I know. To say that you think you know something is merely to say that you believe that you know something.
Right.
To say that you think something or believe something or opine something is simply to assert that something is the case. If I say,
Yep.
this is a glass of beer, or I think this is a glass of beer, or I believe this is a glass of beer, or it's my opinion that this is a glass of beer, those are all the same thing. They all assert the proposition, this is a glass of beer, and that I assent to it, right? You can either assent, you can just say, this is a glass of beer. You can just say, or you can explicitly assent, say, I, Ozzy, here, now, speaking of this thing here, assert that this is a glass of beer, right? There's no difference there. There's no difference between saying, I think this is the case, I believe this is the case, I opine this is the case, or just saying what you think is the case, or what is the case. Those are all semantically the same thing. The only difference is that we often use words like believe and think and opine to qualify in such a way as to indicate that we're not maximally confident of it, right? So I'll say, well, I think this is a glass of beer. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's mead, right? Yeah. I might say, I think, right? There we're using the word think, not to merely signal the proposition that we're assenting to, but also to express certain reservations that we have with respect to our confidence in that proposition.
Yeah.
Right? So you can qualify that, right? And that's why people will often say, oh, well, when you say that you merely believe something, you're not really asserting it. Well, no, when you say I believe X, and when you say X is the case, you're assenting to the same proposition. It's just that very often, in some contexts, we use the word believe to merely mean assent, and sometimes we use it as a qualifier to indicate some reservations.
I mean, can I also point out that the statement itself, that could you be wrong about everything that you know? I mean, if I know that I could be wrong about everything that I know, and I am wrong about everything that I know, wouldn't that mean that I knew one thing?
Right.
I could be wrong about everything that I knew. So I mean,
that's why they do it.
Yeah.
Could you be wrong about that then?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's impossible for me to be wrong about everything that I claim to know, because there's at least one thing that I know, and that's I could be wrong about everything that I know.
They do ask it on purpose. Like they add the think in there. They add that on purpose, and there's a Hovind video out there that he actually explains why that they actually add everything that you think that you know.
Yeah, well, no, they have to add that because knowledge is true by definition, right? Anything that is, right. If you actually know that something is the case, then it's true, and then you can't be wrong, right? Actually, it's really funny because when Bible Thumping Wingnut responded to my video, what he actually wrote was, "Could you be wrong about everything you know?" And yeah. I wrote, the first thing to say is that the question you've just asked is ill-posed. If by knowledge you have in mind something like justified true belief, then it's impossible, by definition, for me to be wrong about what I know, because knowledge implies truth. Nobody is wrong about what they know, because knowledge implies truth. So if I actually do know something, then by hypothesis, it's true, and I can't be mistaken about it. So that way of formulating the question is incorrect, and that's why people are right, the presuppositionalists are right, if they formulate it as, could you be mistaken about everything that you think you know, or believe that you know, or take that you know, or some other qualifier. They have to put another qualifier in there of some sort, because you can't be mistaken about what you in fact know.
I'm wondering if at some point during the Hangout 2 we'll invest a little bit of time on the issue that you just touched on, Ozzy, too, about the way that we use some of these words. Like, I agree that denotatively, when you say here's proposition X. I believe X is true. I think X is true. Right? The X is true. Those words coming out of my mouth are all exactly, they're denotatively equivalent. But we do use the words, and I wonder if we can do a brief segment, maybe after. We don't want to hold up Floyd too much, but on how so much of this rung of cyclone presuppositionalism turns on equivocation fallacies and misusing the way that we use these terms in commonplace language. So, for example, we do use a lot of those words, believe, think, assume, know, as indicate, because they all mean the same thing denotatively. Well, then why do we have all those words? Well, we have them because informally we use them as cues to each other about our subjective assessment of confidence, right? Do you, I assume that is beer you're drinking. right? That's not turpentine, or I assume. Is that what assume means, right? When we say assume, but see, conversationally, we'll say, well, I assume the guy made it to the meeting on time. It's things like that. We sort of say it like, well, I guess I don't really have proof of that. Well, that's not what an assumption is. So we have these words: I believe this, but I know that. I assume this. And you watch how many times that is a major part of what the presuppers do in conversation with us is they sleight of hand with a lot of those words. And this is one of the weird, like when actually Floyd's slide here says, could you be wrong about everything you know? And we spent some time here focusing
claim
on
to know.
Everything you claim to know. Right, sorry, yeah. Could you be wrong about everything you claim to know? And we kind of focus on the everything. Well, I could be wrong about a lot of things that I claim to know, but could I be wrong about everything? Yes, I think that's an important issue. But I think we also need to address the issue of what does it mean? Let's just take a single belief, a single proposition, and say, well, could you be wrong about that particular belief? And is it possible that you're wrong about that? Right? If you ask me, is my car still in my parking spot? Well, yes, it is. I believe it is. And then you say, well, do you know it is? I say, well, I suppose it's possible that somebody stole it. Right? That's not what the word possible means used formally. I'm now asserting something about the, I forgot the term for it. Well, why don't we press on with this and we'll cycle back to it. But I do want to address the thing about, is it possible that you're wrong about something you claim to know? Could you be wrong about what you claim to know? Because I think we're answering that question honestly and informally, only to have it sort of jerked around back on us with the formal language used in a noose-like fashion.
Yeah. Again, if you're dealing with an arrogant cyclone who just wants to trip you up, he's going to respond based on what, his ontology, what exists within his worldview. Well, you can do the same. You can say, well, how can I know things? Well, I posit a world that has physical, natural regularities, and there exist systems where natural selection produces reliable senses and cognitive abilities. So because of these things existing in my worldview, I can know things. Now to assert that, you have to have prior presuppositions to know that. But ultimately, we're going to rely on our presuppositions of our worldview to basically account for anything, and that's exactly what they do. And you'll hear from them as well, is that you give up rationality or knowledge if you cannot justify your knowledge, senses, and reason. Well, again, we can appeal, we can offer an account from what exists in our worldview as an account, because that's what they do. All right.
Well, sure. Okay, it's kind of like it's sure. I give up knowledge in the way that you're stating it.
Yeah. All right. Here's another example. Hagtai and I have been going back and forth with arcane logos for, I don't know, last 3 or 4 days or something. And here's a response. Here's a comment Arcane made to me. He said, Floyd, your worldview doesn't allow knowledge, only assumptions. You assume solipsism is false, but you can't know it. Your worldview reduces to skepticism, for which you have no rational grounds to critique mine. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Okay, if my worldview was completely invalid, irrational, contradictory, and so forth, that doesn't mean that I can't critique his worldview. A fellow Christian could critique his worldview. I could borrow his account for logic and knowledge and so forth to critique his worldview. So it's really irrelevant what my worldview says or can account for to be able to critique his. I'll just take his presuppositions and go from there. So the idea, if we don't have an account or our worldview is invalid, that we have no rational grounds to critique theirs, is this a non sequitur? It's just totally false. You can say arcane layer this basically is just showing some bravado here, claiming that I lost and so forth, and he he claims to have a quote from Ozzy saying, "I have no guarantee for anything I know is correct." So therefore, basically Arcane is appealing to fallibilism. If you're a fallibilist, you can't know anything because you have to have an actual guarantee.
Well, and it's that he's like Hogtie was saying a little bit ago. He's equivocating at that point on knowledge, because sure, the way, like I said, the way he was stating to begin with, sure, I give up that ability if you're going to use it in a way that I'm not agreeing to.
Yeah, yeah. So how do I respond to this? I say no. I haven't lost it all. Your accusations are false. You haven't shown solipsism is false without begging the question of assuming your presuppositions. So again, he's just saying, well, solipsism is false because my worldview says so. Okay, your worldview has presuppositions as well. We all start with presuppositions. Do you deny this? And he never answers my questions. And I point out, my rational ground to critique your worldview is to identify contradictions and problems. I've done this already. I gave an example of his ontology is populated by evil, deceiving demons and his own God that sends strong delusions and lying spirits. And you have failed to respond to them. I gave him a number of questions which he didn't respond to. You assume solipsism is false as well. All you can say is, my worldview denies solipsism. Well, so does mine. We're both in the same epistemic boat. You really don't understand the problem here. What guarantee do you exactly have? You admit you're fallible, so you have no guarantee at all. You as a presupper think that you are allowed to deposit an entire physical backstory to serve as a guarantor of your beliefs and ground your epistemology. Well, so can I. I don't need your God to do that. I am doing everything that you're doing, but leaving your God out of the equation. The question is, what logical validation can you offer for your metaphysical beliefs without begging the question? Do you think you can do that? If so, offer your syllogism. I won't be holding my breath. Okay, Arcane responds, so you're disagreeing with your pastor, Ozzy? I say no. The difference between justifying your beliefs based on my fallible nature and justifying your beliefs based on the presuppositions of my worldview, you are simply doing the latter. All you're saying is, based on my presupposition, I can know things. I can do that as well. Ozzy and I simply acknowledge that there are no rational justification for those presuppositions themselves. That is what you fail to recognize. For deeper clarification, I recommend the following clip. This is a recent clip on my channel, taken from a hangout with Ozzy. You can go on my channel to view it. That clip is called "Why Presuppositionalism Cannot Justify Our Properly Basic Beliefs." Okay, getting back to I say, when you're asked, how do you know your senses are valid? How do you answer? You answer, my God created us in his own image with reliable senses so we can know things. So what you're saying is, based on my presuppositions of my worldview, my senses are reliable. Well, based on my presuppositions, my senses are reliable as well. And that's where the dialogue stopped. You didn't respond to that. Okay, so Arcane's major point here is your worldview doesn't allow knowledge, only assumptions. Saka, could you play the first video that we have, the first YouTube video now, please? Saka? Okay, here we go.
In the nature of the case, an ultimate standard must authorize itself. And that's why unbelieving systems of thought have to be pressed to see that they have got an ultimate authority for their thinking, just like you have an ultimate authority for your thinking. And when it gets around to verifying that ultimate authority over against the other person's ultimate authority, I will end up eventually assuming my ultimate authority. But so will the unbeliever. The unbeliever will assume his or her ultimate authority in the process of reasoning, and I will assume my ultimate authority in the process of reasoning, even when we're talking about what the ultimate authority should be.
All right. So, Saka, I think you need to quit that app.
No, it worked.
Okay. All right. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back to being white boxed.
All right. Right now I just see your icon up, your avatar up.
No, it's working. It's your screen. Floyd.
Okay. All right. So getting back, that was Dr. Greg Bahnsen again. He has a PhD in epistemology from the University of Southern California, and he's going to lecture there about the myth of neutrality. This is where I got the clip from. It's available on YouTube for you to watch the whole thing. So this is from the myth of neutrality lecture, where he says, when it gets around to verifying the ultimate authority against the other person's ultimate authority, I will end up eventually assuming my ultimate authority, but so will the unbeliever. So we're talking about assumptions here. Okay, what is this ultimate authority that Greg Bahnsen is actually talking about? He's actually talking about our presuppositions. Greg Bahnsen defines presuppositions as such. He says a presupposition is an elementary assumption in one's reasoning or in the process by which opinions are formed. It is not just any assumption in an argument, but a personal commitment that is held at the most basic level at one's network of beliefs. Presuppositions form a wide-ranging foundational perspective or starting point in terms of which everything else is interpreted and evaluated. As such, presuppositions have the greatest authority in one's thinking, and being treated as one's least negotiable and being granted the highest immunity to revision. So again, we're talking about assumptions. We're starting with assumptions. Now, how are these presuppositions held? What are they based on? Saka, if you could play the next video, please.
Sure, 1 second.
Now, all I'm trying to point out here is that a person's presuppositions in the nature of the case could not be a matter that's verified by natural science, because natural science has its own presuppositions. Okay? Well, they aren't verified by natural science, which itself depends on presuppositions. Then our most basic presuppositions are held by faith, aren't they? Everybody's got a basic faith. The presuppositions that we hold are held by faith, but that isn't to say that it is some kind of arbitrary, willy-nilly leap. Like, I'll just believe anything. That's what some people think faith is. Faith is just, having this commitment to whatever you want to be committed to, regardless of the evidence. So as long as you don't interpret the word faith in that way, then what I'm saying here is that a worldview is a network of presuppositions held on faith.
Okay, so what are presuppositions held on? They're held on by faith. To try to justify them, you end up arguing in a circle. Thus, you cannot rationally justify them in pain of circularity. So you have to take them on faith. So everyone starts with assumptions. To continue on, in The Problem of Faith, Greg Bahnsen writes, no assumptions make no sense. So if there can be no assumed starting point for a demonstration, then no demonstration can get started or finished, depending upon how you look at it. So it's Greg, again, I'll repeat, no assumptions makes no sense. In his writing, Presuppositional Procedure, Greg Bahnsen writes, we must reason by presupposition. And again, Greg Bahnsen, in his Worldview Issues lecture, he states our most basic presuppositions are held by faith. Presuppositions we hold are by faith. A worldview is a network of presuppositions held on faith. This is actually biblical as well. In Hebrews 11:3, we read, by faith we understand that the world was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things which do not appear. So again, presuppositions are held by faith.
Faith is something I've railed against, people being scared of that word. Most theists don't hold a blind faith. I think that is the misuse of the term more than anything. And I think Hogtie pointed out in his last one with Arcane that line of reason, of pre-rational, the precept, and then rationalizing. He shows a line instead of trying to circularly go at your presuppositions.
Yeah. So we're all in the same epistemic boat. And by that is we all start with our presuppositions and reason from them. So to say we don't start with any assumptions, well, if a presupper is going to say that, they're actually disagreeing with probably the top presupper of them all, who has a PhD in epistemology.
Could I say something to this?
Sure.
Yeah, it's a really important issue. It goes to this issue of internal versus external critique. Presuppositionalism, again, properly construed, is supposed to proceed by showing the falsity of a non-Christian worldview, or if you're a Muslim, presuppositionalism, a non-Muslim worldview, or whatever type of presuppositionalist you are. You're supposed to show the falsity of an alien worldview, another worldview than your own, by bracketing your own presuppositions, adopting for the sake of argument the assumptions of the other person, and then exploring that worldview from within and looking for inadequacies and inconsistencies within that worldview. And if you can show that a person isn't in fact living in accordance with what can be delivered by that worldview, then they're effectively living in bad faith. They're believing one thing but living another thing. What that means is that you are supposed to. Oh, actually, hang on a second. Is anyone else hearing feedback?
No, everything's fine.
Yeah.
I hear you fine.
Yeah, I hear you fine too.
Okay, I'm getting a looping. I'm getting a looping effect.
Maybe if you refresh, because it's not on this end.
Yeah. Okay. Carry on. I'll be right back. Sorry about this.
Okay.
No problem.
And we assume the turpentine is kicking in.
Yeah. Yeah, and as far as trying to justify your presuppositions, well, Cornelius Van Til makes an interesting comment. For example, Christians hold the presupposition that that the Bible is the Word of God. How do they justify that? With divine revelation? That's circular. Cornelius Van Til says, "Who wishes to make such a simple blunder in elementary logic as to say we believe something is true because it is in the Bible?" Our answer to this is briefly that we prefer to reason in a circle to not reasoning at all. We hold it to be true that circular reasoning is the only reasoning that is possible to finite man. So here, pretty much the modern creator, so to speak, of presuppositionalists acknowledge that your foundational presuppositions are circular as far as justifying them. If you try to justify them, you're going to argue in a circle. And most honest presuppositionalists will, in fact, do that. Arcane made the claim that if a worldview starts with unjustified presuppositions, then Arcane himself will reject that worldview. That's his claim. Okay? So Arcane's worldview starts with presuppositions. Then Arcane cannot justify his presuppositions without arguing in a circle, and he openly admitted that before. If Arcane cannot justify his presuppositions without arguing in a circle, then Arcane's worldview starts with unjustified presuppositions. That's the informal fallacy of circular reasoning. 5. Arcane's worldview starts with unjustified presuppositions. That's modus ponens from 3 and 4. Therefore, Arcane rejects his worldview. That's modus ponens from 1 and 5. So if Arcane is going to stick with the idea that if we start with assumptions, if we start with unjustified presuppositions, then it should be rejected. Well, I'm afraid he's going to have to reject his own worldview. So, Arcane, if you're watching, here's a syllogism. Feel free to refute this. Okay. All right, this is my last slide. I'm going to offer some pointers on how to critique a presupper's worldview. I recommend sticking with an internal critique when challenged them. Understand their worldview, understand their presuppositions, what exists in there, and find internal inconsistencies and problems within them. When asked why you reject Christianity, well, you can appeal to external evidence because they're asking you about your view, your worldview. So you can point to archaeological problems, about historical and scientific problems, and so forth. But if you're going to be critiquing them, their worldview, I recommend sticking with an internal critique. And from that, try to understand their position. Do not strawman them. Do your homework, do your research, try to understand the position they actually hold. And strategies I suggest, well, you can point out Bible contradictions, the fact that there's supernatural deceiving agents in their worldview, failed, false, imaginary prophecy. I gave a deeper Dogma episode on biblical prophecy, textual criticism of the Bible, the nature of their Bible God. I had a debate with Maximus about whether or not the Bible God is truly loving based on the Bible's own definition of love. Again, that's an internal critique, not on what my standard of love is, based on the Bible's standard of love. So those are certain strategies you can critique their worldview. So that is the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
I thought that was really good. Very thorough.
Thanks.
Yeah, if I could sort of finish the point that I started making earlier, when you're analyzing a worldview, you're supposed to operate from those presuppositions when you're doing an internal critique. It makes no sense to say of another person's presuppositions, oh, but those aren't justified. Right? The whole point of presuppositionalism is everyone has presuppositions. That is, everyone has assumptions that are unstated, that are implicit usually, but they can be consciously aware of them in principle, if they're reflective. And they are unjustified because those are the things by means of which you do justify everything else. And so to demand, oh, but you need a justification for those things, is to demand a justification for that which is offered, which is put forward unabashedly as unjustified, right? So, for instance, I have properly basic beliefs, a bunch of assumptions that I think I and everyone effectively makes, which typically go unchallenged, that we simply operate by. But everyone has these. We can disagree on what constitutes a properly basic belief and what a specific instance of a properly basic belief is, but the point is we all start from some assumptions, or you could call them axioms if you prefer, although I think axioms are a little different. But the point is they are your starting point. It makes no sense to say of a starting point, oh, what's your starting point for your starting point? And there is no starting point for my starting point. There's no starting point behind my starting point, right? And now if I were to try to justify my starting point by something that comes afterward, then of course I'm going to argue in a circle. So of course the solution is, don't make the mistake of thinking that you can justify your starting point by conclusions derived from your starting point, because if you do that, you are going to argue in a circle. Any properly educated presuppositionalist is going to know that you can't do that, and that's a bogus objection. But the cyclones don't understand that presuppositionalism assumes that there are these fundamental, elementary beliefs that admit of no justification, and that they are the starting point, and that the way that you're supposed to vitiate or disprove another worldview is not by questioning the starting point and saying you don't have a justification for it, but by showing that based on the conclusions from that starting point, you have inconsistencies, incoherencies in the worldview, not by challenging the lack of justification of the starting point, right? Because the presuppositionalist is in the same boat. So whenever you hear a presuppositionalist say, "Oh, but you can't justify your basic starting point, your elementary assumptions," that person doesn't understand presuppositionalism and doesn't understand his or her own apologetic, doesn't understand that they're literally in the same boat. That there's no escape from that, and that's not how the critique of another worldview is supposed to proceed according to presuppositionalism. You know you're talking to a cyclone when you hear that objection.
I agree. I've often stated that I'm not a presuppositionalist, but I'm a better presuppositionalist than some of the presuppositionalists on the internet, on YouTube and whatnot. And there are very few who I've actually interacted with who I'd say do hold tried and true to the presuppositionalist method. Arcane is not one of them, but I am friends with people who I believe are. And in terms of presuppositionalism starting off in circular argumentation, I often said that it's not too bad at first I thought it was a huge problem when looking at it. In fact, that's something I brought up often. It's just all circular reasoning that's justified post hocly. However, I do think now, studying epistemology a little better, the presuppositionalist could just start off with a position in philosophy, in epistemology called coherentism, which is just the notion that the foundations of knowledge are about how coherent the axioms are together as your general starting point. That's just kind of a basic coherentism. And then, of course, those axioms are held not unjustifiably. They're held because you have to kind of you're going to have to kind of, to borrow the term, presuppose them in order to have a starting point. So your first set of axioms are on the house, but the next ones better not have anything circular within them. And of course, if you're going to include those axioms within the ones you started off with, then you're augmenting your position from whence you started. Just to use a popular example, who isn't a presuppositionalist, by the way, but people often put him in the camp. Alvin Plantinga was a classical foundationalist and an internalist when it came to knowledge. However, he realized that there were tons of things that foundationalism proper couldn't really work with. So, for example, how do you know that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago? That's something that just presupposing the laws of logic aren't really going to get you anywhere. Because even a world created 5 minutes ago is logically coherent. So, of course, Plantinga applied a form of externalism plus a form of reliabilism on top of that. And of course, he didn't just justify that by he didn't just go about that by saying, okay, I'm presupposing these. He's saying the foundation, my foundations can only be strong if I were to include them. And of course, in epistemology, it's more along the lines of the impossibility to the contrary. If you, which starts off with Aristotle, if you do not take up this axiom, then if you're automatically resorting to what's known as a reductio ad absurdum, where everything isn't making logical sense, then you know, or you have to believe in an absurdity that you would never pragmatically apply to your everyday living, such as believing that you're a brain in a vat, then obviously you've gone the wrong way about things. So I think there is a better way to do presuppositionalism, and if many presuppositionalists who are on the internet who don't really know the background of all this, they pick up a book on epistemology. It never hurts. And it's really a better way to start off with than just seeing Cy 10 Bergenkate give his terrible presentations of very, very simplistic takes on Bonson and even on Van Zyl, because I've actually read a bit of Bonson, and I was much more impressed than I thought I would be going into his work, especially his dissertation on self-deception, which I would actually implore anyone to check out because it's available free online.
If I could just add a little coda to that, I think there's a problem with for presuppositionalists who want to endorse any kind of coherentism. coherentism, for people who don't know, is one of the theories of within epistemology. For instance, there are coherence theories of truth that say that truth isn't correspondence with reality. For instance, that would be a correspondence theory of truth. But coherence, but rather truth, has to do with how well your belief set is internally consistent, how it coheres together. But most presuppositionalists, arguably every presuppositionalist I've ever heard or read, would subscribe to a correspondence theory of truth and not a coherence theory. So there'd be a problem there. They tend to be fairly wedded to the correspondence theory of truth. So I think that would be an obstacle for them, I think.
That would be an obstacle, but I think I might have misused the term coherentism. I just meant in terms of a building. Yeah, I think that was poorly used on my end. I just meant in terms of starting off with properly basic axioms. Those aren't circular because I was trying to use coherentism as kind of a parallel, but not having it properly understood in mind. I think it might have just went downhill. So I apologize for that.
No, that's okay actually, because I mean, there's an important point in there, and that is that presuppositionalists tend to be foundationalists. That is, they envision knowledge and the structure of a person's belief, the architecture of your beliefs, as like a building with a foundation and layers of bricks, and and if the foundation is no good, then the building is going to be crooked and collapse. There's going to be something wrong. So they think of knowledge as something that you sort of build on layer by layer, and there has to be a solid foundation. The foundation, they think, has to be indubitable, not subject to doubt, which they tend to confuse with inerrancy, not subject to error. But I mean, I think that entire picture of knowledge is wrong. I think that a better picture of knowledge is something closer to coherence, the kind of coherence that you're talking about, Maximus, which is sometimes the raft analogy or the spider web analogy. Think of knowledge not as a building, as a structure where if you just sort of rip out one brick at the bottom, the whole thing could come tumbling down, but like a spider web. In a spider web, the strands are mutually reinforcing. You can cut any particular spider web, and it'll affect the integrity and structure of the web, and you can attach another strand in there, but the whole thing doesn't collapse. There's no one strand that supports the entire web, right? Or like a raft. A raft is not one plank or one beam that keeps the whole raft afloat. If you pull that out, it's not like the whole thing falls apart. And consequently, you can revise your raft while you're at sea, while you're floating. You can tinker with it and change it, so it ends up looking completely different, with a completely different structure and architecture. So things are not as brittle as people imagine. If you're a foundationalist and you imagine that knowledge has to start with self-evident truths or indubitable axioms or something like that, well, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time finding anything that qualifies as a self-evident truth or as an indubitable axiom, except perhaps in certain formal domains like arithmetic or formal logic or something like that. But then you're going to have a hard time building anything on that. You're going to be stuck in that domain. You're not going to be able to say anything about the external world. I mean, people from Descartes onwards have tried to do that, and that is a failed philosophical project. So I think foundationalism is just really off the table, philosophically speaking. And any epistemological position that is predicated on the truth of the foundationalist view of knowledge is in trouble.
I think I think maybe it's due to my naivete, but I'm still not convinced it's a failed project. But that's just me.
Well, there are other options. I mean, there's a middle course, for instance. There's something called found-herentism, which is something I'm sympathetic to. Yeah, it's something I'm actually sympathetic with.
Yeah, Susan Hackett has that position, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Susan Hackett does.
Yeah. So right now...
Sorry, I think Hogtie was waiting to get in with something. He's still here.
He's
he's AFK.
He's just stepped away. Do you mind if I ask you a quick question, Ozzy? Just for my...
No.
Brilliant. For me, it's been a bit of a difficult thing to get into the idea of having knowledge. I still haven't got past this idea of justification. So, assuming one's justification to be true, representative of knowledge. So perhaps like the assumptions we make there, or the assumptions that we have to contest there, because I don't see how I can get, I don't see how I can have knowledge without first assuming that I have knowledge, essentially.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, a word or two about justification. The operative definition within most presuppositionalist discourse is a definition of knowledge called the JTB definition of knowledge. JTB stands for justified true belief. Okay, and a lot of people will have heard this. It's been bandied around for a long time. And the reason a lot of people have heard this, even if they're not familiar with presuppositionalism, because presuppositionalists didn't come up with this either, is that it's a very old definition of knowledge. It's the oldest definition of knowledge in the history of philosophy. It was put forward in a dialogue called the Theaetetus by Plato. And Plato asks, what do we mean by knowledge? How do we distinguish knowledge from right opinion, an opinion that just happens to be correct, right? For instance, if I shake a magic 8-ball and I make all my decisions based on what the magic 8-ball says, some of the time, I'm going to be doing the right thing, and certain predictions will turn out true, but it's not a very reliable process, right? So if I use that as my justification, or if I decide whether it's going to rain outside and whether or not I should bring an umbrella by flipping a coin every morning, and not looking at the clouds and not looking at a meteorology report, some of the time I'm going to be right, but we wouldn't say that I know it's going to rain because I flipped a coin and it came up tails, right? That's not a proper justification. So the idea of justified true belief is that for something to constitute knowledge, you first have to have at least a belief, right? I can't believe that this is an empty glass of beer. I can't know that this is an empty glass of beer, if it is empty, or an almost empty glass of beer, unless I at least believe it. If I didn't believe that this was a near empty glass of beer, I couldn't say that I know that it's an near empty glass of beer. Right? I don't even believe it. I
agree with you there. Absolutely, right, okay. I agree with you there. From my perspective, I would say I have an experience, and then I formulate a belief upon that experience, and then I experience again. For me, the difficulty is how many instances of those two things occurring before I can finally qualify it as knowledge.
Right. Well, hang on. There's a
yeah. No problem. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. There's a deep aspect to this question that I'm getting to, and that's why I'm sort of telling this story about what JTB is. So there are three conditions on knowledge. One is you at least have to have the belief that P before you can know that P. P has to be true. I can't know that this is an empty glass of beer. It's now empty. I can't know that this is an empty beer glass unless it's true that it's an empty beer glass. If this is if this glass of beer is full of beer and I believe that it's empty, then my belief is false, and then I can't know that the glass of beer is empty when it's in fact full. So that's why there's a truth condition. Now, notice that truth condition is a metaphysical condition. It's a state of affairs that it has to obtain. If that state of affairs obtains, and I believe that it's true, then I have a true belief. Okay, so well, what's justification then? Well, justification
real quick before you get into justification, does the belief have to be true? Is that what you said?
Yeah, to have knowledge.
As well as the state of affairs.
Corresponds to reality.
It has to be true, and the state of affairs have to be true.
No, states of affairs are states of affairs. States of affairs can't be true. Sentences can be true. Propositions can be true. Statements can be true. Beliefs can be true. States of affairs are just states of affairs. They can't be true or false, right? So the state of affair is what makes something true or false. It's what makes a proposition, a belief, a statement, or a sentence true or false. It's the state of affairs that makes it the case that one of those things is true or false. States of affairs are not themselves true or false. So if the state of affairs holds and my belief matches the state of affairs, then we say I have a true belief. Right? So notice that truth here is a metaphysical condition. It just describes a state of affairs. So what's the point of justification? Well, justification is that thing which is supposed to connect your belief with the state of affairs, so that my belief is not just a damn coincidence like flipping a coin, right? So that my belief results from, is caused by, is a consequence of, is conditioned by the state of affairs. So that if my belief arises in the right way, right, as a result of the state of affairs, then that justifies my belief in that state of affairs. That's the function of justification. It's to connect, it's to tether, to tie my belief to the state of affairs in a principled, non-arbitrary way. So it's not just a matter of luck, like flipping a coin, for instance. Now, so now your question, Alex, is, well, wait a minute. How do I know that my justification is right? Right? Well, you can ask the question, how do I know my justification is right? Now you're making a different knowledge claim. You're making the claim that my justification is correct, and you want to know why is my justification correct, and you can ask that. That is exactly where the regress starts. A person says, in order to know that P, that this is an empty glass of beer, P has to be true. I have to believe that P, and I have to have some justification for believing that P. Namely, I can see with my eyes. I'm having a visual experience of an empty beer glass. Okay. But wait, a person can say, well, wait, how do you know that your senses are not deceiving you, or that you're not dreaming this right now, right? In which case, there's no beer glass at all. I'm just dreaming all of this, right? That's a perfectly good question. Now what you're asking is, how do I justify my justification, right? And if I give you a reason for why I think I'm not dreaming and why I can trust my eyesight right now, and I don't think my eyes are deceiving me, for instance, and why I think I'm not a brain in a vacuum, supposing I give you reasons why that would be, you could ask, well, wait a minute. What if those justifying reasons are themselves called into question? Can't I call those into question? Yes, of course you can call them into questions. But now you'll notice we're in a regress, right? A justificatory regress. It's an infinite justificatory regress. This justificatory regress arises because what you're doing is, as a condition of knowledge, you're making it the case that the cognitive agent, me, the cognizer here, has to know that his justification is right. You're not just saying, Oz, in order to know that this is a beer glass, you have to have a justified true belief. You also have to know that this is a beer glass. You have to know that your justification is correct, and you have to know that your justification is correct. And then you'll have to know that that justification is correct, and you'll have to know that that justification, and on and on and on into a regress. That's the KK principle. That's the know that you know principle. That's the definition of knowledge, the definition of justification specifically, that construes justification as something that only is satisfied when you couldn't be wrong about it. And the cognitive agent has at his or her conscious disposal current experiences which could justify the experience, and that is guaranteed that the experience happens. But nothing can satisfy the KK condition, which is why so many epistemologists just think, no, the KK condition cannot be part of what we mean by justification, because if you make the KK principle a necessary ingredient in the concept of justification, no belief could ever be justified. No belief in logic, in math, in ordinary science, in ordinary life. And so most epistemologists now just sort of reject the KK principle as a non-starter. If that's true, justification is impossible. If justification is impossible, then presumably knowledge is impossible, assuming justification is part of your definition of knowledge. Not all philosophers think justification is part of knowledge, part of the definition of knowledge. So a lot of epistemologists say that no, that if you think that the KK principle is a necessary ingredient in justification, and justification is a necessary ingredient in knowledge, then knowledge is an impossibility.
Yeah, that's internalism, right? That's internalism.
Right. You're requiring an internalist condition be satisfied. So what's the alternative? The alternative that many epistemologists subscribe to, oh, and by the way, presuppositionalists too, although the cyclones don't get this, is to say, look, justification is an objective matter. It doesn't have to be something that you're aware of. If you're aware of your justification, fantastic. Here's a way of thinking about this, of understanding this. Let us say, hypothetically, that this is an empty glass of beer. Ozzy knows that this is an empty glass of beer because the truth condition is satisfied. Ozzy believes that this is an empty glass of beer. And Ozzy is having an experience, a visual experience of an empty glass of beer. And that empty glass of beer, that experience of the empty glass of beer, is being physically caused by the fact that there is an empty glass of beer here. In other words, if that story is true, then I know what I think I know. Right? If that story is true, then I know what I think I know. Just like, so notice, just as truth is an external condition, right? So, truth is an external condition. It has nothing to do with me, right? I mean, if there's a glass of beer here and my belief is true because there is a truth condition that is being satisfied. Similarly, justification is an external condition. In other words, under the externalist conception of justification, the cognitive agent doesn't have to know what his justification is. There just has to be a justification. And if there is a justification, if there is a set of causal conditions which are responsible for the experience, then under those conditions, I know that there's an empty beer glass here. And if those conditions are not satisfied, if, for instance, I'm dreaming, I'm mad, I'm hallucinating, I'm tripping out on drugs or whatever, then I wouldn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the problem? Well, you'll say, yeah, but Ozzy, then you don't know that you know. You're right. I don't know that I know, but that doesn't mean that I don't know. I can know that this is a glass of beer, but I don't know that I know it. Who the hell ever said that in order to know that this is a glass of beer, I have to know that I know it? Who says that? The only person who says that is a person who insists on the KK principle. The KK principle is not a truism. It's not necessarily right. In fact, epistemologists tend to just reject it as a non-starter. So under the externalist conception of justification, justification is an external condition, and if it holds, then you're going to be justified.
What about, so if you're an internalist, do you have to hold to the KK principle? Because I identify myself as an internalist, but I don't know if I necessarily would hold to the KK principle.
That gets a little tricky, but no, in principle you don't have to subscribe to the KK principle to be an internalist, but most internalists do, because usually the thing that motivates a person to be an internalist is an implicit assumption that the KK principle is true. So an internalist, by the way, just to be clear, is a person who believes that justification consists of the agent knowing what his reasons are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, if externalism is right, if the externalist conception of justification is the correct account of justification, you might ask, well, why do we demand justification from people if it's not necessary that you know it, right? If it's not necessary that you know your own justification, why do we demand it? For pragmatic reasons. If I want to persuade you that this is an empty glass of beer, right, then I want to be able to state and retrace what the causal connection is if I can find out what it is. I might not be able to find out what it is. But now notice, whether you're a presuppositionalist or not, my dog recognizes that there's food in his dog dish. My dog doesn't know anything about epistemology. My dog doesn't know anything about optics. He doesn't know anything about light. He doesn't know anything about his visual cortex and his eyeballs and the optic nerve and how any of that works. He doesn't know the causal story of how the dog bowl being there is part of the causal story for why the dog has the visual experience of a dog bowl and thus forms the belief that there's a dog bowl full of food there, right? But my dog knows that there's food in his dish if those conditions obtain. If those conditions obtain, then my dog knows what he thinks he knows. If those conditions don't obtain, then he doesn't know it, right? That's the externalist conception of justification. But if you want to be able to persuade some other person that you're in a position of knowledge, that's when you want to be able to state it. Dogs can't state their justification. We, fortunately, are sometimes in a position that we can retrace the causal steps that lead from the belief that we have back to the cause of the belief.
What if, for example, you're... so I would understand that an externalist would generally hold on to a very reliabilistic system. Like they would, like for example, if one would ask, how do you know your senses are working? Well, one would kind of make appeals to kind of an evolutionary reliabilism where our sense experiences are reliable because they developed through evolutionary mechanisms that conditioned our brains to be well adjusted to take in external information, and right. that's kind of how we know that our knowledge is reliable.
That's not how we know. That's what makes it reliable.
That's what makes it reliable.
It's not how you know that you know. It's what makes it reliable. And the idea is, under the externalist conception of justification, justification is about what are the conditions that make something a justified belief, not how do you know that something is a justified belief.
I see.
Right? Yeah. In other words, if you know that you know, that's great. I mean, if it so happens that you know the justification for your true belief, fantastic. That's gravy. Then you're in a position to persuade other people.
So, okay.
Yeah, I want to point out that presuppositionalists will adhere to externalism but for you, they will demand an internalist justification. So that's the double standard, another trick that pre-suppers do. They're externalists, but they will demand an internalist justification from you.
So an internalist justification, I would probably give, with regards to how do I know, is I usually probably give a bit of a criterion. So, for example, if usually these notions I kind of fathom as coming from a form of skepticism or a form of questioning. So, but the questioning itself, as far as I'm concerned, presupposes that even the questions the skeptic is posing to you have to make sense. So if the questioning gets to a point where something like the law of non-contradiction doesn't make sense, like how do you know the law of non-contradiction doesn't work? Well, doesn't the skeptic have to presuppose, or me critiquing myself have to presuppose that the law of non-contradiction holds for that question to even make sense in the first place? So for me, it's either going to boil down to a place where questioning no longer makes sense, and if it doesn't boil down to that, I should try to come up with a further justification with regards to that I know. So that's kind of how I parse it out in my mind, and it's internalistic, mostly because of the fact that I don't have to appeal to anything outside of it.
I'd like to emphasize something that Floyd just said about the double standard that the cyclones apply. When you hear a cyclone say, "How do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that?" You'd swear they must be internalists. They're insisting on an internal conception of justification. They're insisting, look, you're not entitled to claim that you know something unless you know that your justification is correct, and unless you know that your justification is correct, and unless you know that your justification, and so on. Right? You'd swear they're internalists, right?
Right.
I mean, they're insisting on an internalist conception of justification when they interrogate you. But then when you ask them, wait, how do you know? Oh, well, you see, here's how it is. There's this being, you see, and he's omnipotent, and he's omniscient, and he created the universe, and he created us with reliable belief-forming processes such as vision and memory and reasoning abilities and stuff like that, and he created a world of uniformities and da-da-da-da-da. And if all that story is true, and I don't know how I can establish that story is true, but if that story is true, then I know what I think I know. And so do you know what you think you know. We're all good. We can get on with the world. We can do science. We can trust the evidence of our senses. We can rely on our memories. We can trust in our reasoning. You know, everything's hunky-dory. If that story is true. Well, yeah, that's right. If that story is true, then you know. If that story is true, you know what you think you know. The problem is, as soon as you say, well, wait a minute, you're insisting on an internalist conception of justification, that I be able to give reasons for the reasons for the reasons for the reasons. How about I play that game with you? They go, oh, no. You don't get to do that with me, right? Well, wait a minute. You're applying a double standard. You're insisting that you're entitled to apply the externalist conception of justification, but everyone else has to abide by an internalist and much harder conception of justification. I would say an impossible conception of justification, right? But wait a minute. I mean, it's not like presuppositionalists invented externalism, or that they own it, even if they had invented it. The externalist conception of justification is an older conception of justification, and that conception of justification doesn't require that there be a God. I mean, on my view, we live in a world that, as a matter of brute fact, involves stable regularities. If there are these stable regularities, and you have the systems that evolve on the planet under selective pressures, such that these systems have experiences that systematically co-vary with changing states of affairs around them, then those experiences will mirror the states of affairs around them, and they will be generally reliable, and they will be no more nor less reliable than what a presuppositionalist believes about our senses and our memory and everything else. If that story is true, then I know what I think I know. What's wrong with that story? Well, that too is a story, right? This is an account again. It's a story. It's an explanatory story, which, if true, would ground our knowledge, would make possible knowledge, right? So it's just simply false when they say without a God, you couldn't account for knowledge. Hey, I can account for knowledge 50 different ways, right? There's all kinds of things that I can evoke. I can just invent a metaphysical story and posit whatever entities I want, such that if they exist, then I know what I think I know. And so what it boils down to is this. The presuppositionalist is saying, here's my metaphysical picture of reality. And if it holds, then I can know what I think I know. But anybody else can say, here's my metaphysical picture of reality. And if it holds, I know what I think I know. Mm-hmm. Which one of us is right? Or maybe we're both wrong. Maybe someone else is right. It's simply not enough. It is simply not intellectually satisfying a position as an epistemologist to say I can imagine a set of circumstances which, if they were true, would make knowledge possible. Mm-hmm. Right? You can invent those all day long, and it's certainly false to say I've got one, but nobody else can have one. Hey, anybody can invent things and posit things that have knowledge-conferring abilities and properties. That won't do.
We have it, or we all have a teleology which has a final cause of knowing things.
Yeah, that could be another one. Yeah.
I always like going with the Aristotelian approach, but anyway.
Let me offer a quote from a presuppositionalist which kind of reflects this. This is from John Frame. Yeah, he was a student of Van Til as well. In his paper Presuppositional Apologetics and Introduction Part 1, he says, mysterious though the process may be, somehow God illumines the human mind to discern the divine source of the word. We know without knowing how we know.
There it is. There it is. That's externalism. We can know because there are certain external conditions which, if true, will secure our knowledge. But we don't need to know that we know them. That's externalism. That's presuppositionalism, right? And presuppositionalists aren't the only externalists. I myself am an externalist, as are many, many epistemologists. That is exactly right. And if more cyclones understood that presuppositionalism, properly construed, applies the externalist conception of justification, they wouldn't be going around challenging everyone with an internalist conception of justification, because when they do that, they're abandoning their worldview, they're bracketing their worldview, and they're simply trading on people's naivete and naive intuitions that justification consists of the conscious awareness of the causes of your belief. Look, we all have beliefs. Most of my perceptual beliefs arise rather naturally and passively in me, and I don't know any of the causes. I mean, a few hundred years ago, we didn't know what brains were for. Aristotle thought that the brain was a radiator that cooled the blood. Didn't know that it had anything to do with thinking. They thought that the seat of the emotions and thought existed in other parts of the body, like the liver, the spleen, the heart, because those are the things that responded to emotional states and stuff like that. You simply do not need to be aware of the causes of your belief for you to know. You just need to be aware of the causes of your belief if you want to be in a position to be very confident about your beliefs and to be able to persuade other people, for pragmatic purposes, persuade other people that they should trust you in what you think you know. But it's not a condition on knowledge that you be able to know that you know or be consciously always aware of your reasons. Especially for perceptual beliefs, for instance, or memory, for instance.
Also, for most of us for some of us who are internalists, our position, usually what I like to do, even now knowing that their position is externalistic, and actually it was, Floyd, thank you so much for actually letting me on to this. I think it was during your one of your earlier presentations of this, that I actually now give critiques of their externalism, whereas they're not on par with my internalism, where I find it much easier to go with. In fact, there's in church history there was this very interesting debate that went on about the doctrine of divine illumination. Divine illumination is the theory that people intuit knowledge from God first and foremost, and after intuiting it and obtaining further knowledge from the external world, then that's how you build and stabilize knowledge. It came from Augustine, who kind of was inspired by Plato's forms. He put them in the mind of God, and then he just intuits the forms from the mind of God as it was created, as opposed to us being pre-born into some Platonic realm and then being encapsulated into our bodies. But that view kind of went out during the Scholastic era, first with Thomas Aquinas, not rejecting it fully, but just weaning himself away from it, and then John Duns Scotus, in terms of just further illuminating on a lot of the problems, such as how does the person know that they're getting the right views from God if their fallibility is going to be a problem in determining knowledge? Because even God couldn't make a fallible being know something infallibly. That would kind of go against the law of non-contradiction. So, and he kind of gave his own kind of theory of knowledge, which built knowledge from bedrock of self-evident facts, stuff that you couldn't coherently refute, and then the inductive, and then introspective, and then sensory beliefs from that. So that's how I usually use it. And it's kind of interesting to see how it develops from, even in Christian circles, how people came to reject the theory later on. It's something I'd encourage everyone to look up, because it's kind of funny how ideas circulate throughout history.
Oh, I thought everybody froze up. I was like, I just saw the chat go by there.
Yeah. Well, we came to an impasse. Saka, do you want to wrap it up, or?
Yeah, I mean, you got your presentation out. I think that's a ton of info inside this Hangout. Definitely will have to watch it again.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys pull a big crowd because we had a lot of viewers for this event.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Yeah, some of them really went on.
Great. Yeah, I thought this was a really good hangout. I enjoyed the presentation, Floyd. Sorry I came in a little bit late, but I enjoyed the thing. It was...
Yeah. Well, I mean, Floyd, we'll give last words to you, but if Ozzy, do you have anything that you want to say before we take off?
No, I'll just say thank you, Floyd, for that extremely thorough and carefully thought out presentation. I think it's going to be very useful to a lot of people. Thank you very much.
Okay. And Maximus or Rex, you guys have anything you guys want to say?
Yeah, I just want to echo Ozzy's thanks towards Floyd. It's a very well thought out presentation, and I think we all owe Floyd a great debt of thanks for putting in the man hours in dealing with presuppositionals that many of us do not want to take on ourselves.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. I enjoy doing these things, and I'm glad people are interested and willing to hear what I have to say. So I appreciate that.
Share this Hangout. Reshare it. If you liked it, reshare it.
Tell your friends. Anyway, thank you very much for coming out, and thanks to everybody that watched, and have yourselves a good night.